A home lab is a special thing for nerds like me. From a little router and a Raspberry Pi and a rat's nest of cables, to a giant rack full of servers with screaming fans and petabytes of storage, everyone's home lab has a story. This is my story, at least so far, and I told it at AnsibleFest 2022 in Chicago. After you watch, I'd love to hear about your home lab in the comments below. And if you want to learn about Ansible, check out my book, Ansible for DevOps. This is my home office. It's also my little YouTube studio, and it's in my basement, so it's nice to finally be back at AnsibleFest after 3 years. In fact, AnsibleFest 2019 was the last in-person conference I went to, and if you look behind me, that lanyard is still the last one on my little lanyard hook. So it'll be nice to finally have a new one to put up there. And there are some big companies at AnsibleFest, like Microsoft, Amazon, and Google, like you see here. They all have giant data centers and employ thousands of sysadmins. But me? I represent Midwestern Mac LLC, a tiny little company headquartered in St. Louis. And I don't have a data center, I have a rack. Specifically, I have this rack. This is in my basement, and yes, it's sitting right next to my HVAC system with a condensate pump and humidifier right next to it. That means water lines. And on the other side of it is the basement floor drain, which has backed up a few times. That's why I bought casters for my rack. If you want more where that comes from, check out my rack setup video on the Gearling Engineering YouTube channel. My dad and I have a ton of fun over there working on some projects together. Maybe we have a little too much fun sometimes. But I put my rack on casters because if I get a sewage backup, I'd rather sacrifice the casters than the rack and thousands of dollars of rack equipment. And wouldn't you know, they already came in handy once. Earlier this year, my AC condensate pump actually failed, and the water alarm I set up also failed, and I looked on in horror the day I came downstairs to see this. Luckily, the water was all just going under the rack and wasn't coming out from the rack. None of my servers wet themselves yet. So anyway, my home lab today has 3 main purposes. First, it supports the video production needs of this YouTube channel. Second, it ensures my kids have 5 nines of uptime for Doritos. That's what they call the media app they use to watch all the episodes of Berenstain Bears and all the other kids shows and movies I ripped onto our NAS. And third, it lets me have fun cosplaying as a sysadmin. Hey, I even have a shirt for that. Check it out along with other favorites like my It Was DNS shirt over on redshirtjeff.com. But let's get to the meat of this presentation, the home lab. Every home lab starts with humble beginnings. You move into a new place. What's the first thing you're gonna do? Plug in a router, get the internet. Water, food, a bed, all that stuff can wait. You need to get the internet going ASAP. Most of us start things out with a router. Sometimes it's built into the modem that your ISP sends you. Sometimes you have a separate modem and plug it into another router, like I do here with my Asus Wi-Fi router. But you want to start doing more. You want to store stuff on the network and maybe run some apps like Pi-hole to block ads or a home VPN or a media sharing library. So you add in a NAS. But then you realize running a VPN, Plex, Pi-hole, backup software, and home automation all on a single consumer NAS is a bit fragile. And now you're looking at Craigslist for used server hardware, UPSs, and racks, and your significant other starts wondering why the electric bill shot up so quickly last month. So that brings me to my home lab. The first version you see here was just a piece of plywood with a modem and a network switch. I actually had my Wi-Fi router plugged in upstairs for better signal, so you don't see it in the picture here. But at least I had a little UPS and an empty punch block. I'm not sure why I put that on there. I never even had a phone line at my house, but I guess it looked cool. But I moved everything on this board over to another part of my basement when we remodeled, and I also added a 3G cell for better cell reception in the basement when I started working down there, and a Raspberry Pi to run some local services and the website pidramble.com. But things started getting a little bit more serious when I bought my first rack. And when I bought that thing, I didn't think I'd ever fill it up, but I did. I had the space, so I grabbed a free UPS from a local business that was moving, and that's when I found out that the rails for it and other servers only work in server racks, not a smaller network or AV rack like the one I bought. So I modded this rack. The grinder, a circular saw, and a tap and die set were involved, but dang it, I got that UPS installed. And then I filled up the rest of the thing. I added on a 2.5 gig switch and a 10 gig switch, added some more Raspberry Pis, I started caring about cable management, I added a second NAS so I could have 2 local copies of all my data, and I was quickly running out of rack space to the point I didn't even have room for that new server that you see there laying on the ground. So I invited my dad over, and he helped me upgrade to this bigger rack, the one that I'm using today. And before I talk about automation, I'll walk you through the entire rack. Starting from the top, I have a patch panel with cable drops from around the house and a couple from other parts of the rack for equipment that's down below. Then I have a shelf for random things I can't rack mount, like my Philips Hue Hub, my cable modem, and my Home Assistant Yellow. I put those up near the top since they have radios in them, and the open rack with a wood top lets them connect to IoT devices without any issues. Then there's my 10 gig switch from MikroTik. The core of my network goes through here, so all my storage and wired computers can transfer data around 1 gigabyte per second. In the middle, I have a PoE Plus switch from QNAP that also has a couple 10 gig ports, and I use it to power some Raspberry Pis and my IP cameras. Under that is my Pi rack, where I run most of my networking applications, and I'll get to those in a bit. Then there's a drawer, and I'm not going to show you the inside, just like I won't open up the neat patch and show you the rat's nest of cables in there either. Under all that is my Edit NAS, running TrueNAS with 40 terabytes of raw SSD storage. And if you think that's overkill, just wait a second. Below that are my two storage NASs, one with 6 bays and the other with 4. The one on the right is just a replica of the one on the left, minus a little bit of data that I don't have to have a second copy of, so I have at least 2 complete copies of all the important data in my house. Between those two NASs, I have 200 terabytes of raw capacity. And then there's the Storinator. This thing is from 45 drives, and I actually built what I called the Petapi, a single Raspberry Pi addressing 60 hard drives for a full petabyte through 4 Broadcom HBAs. I did a whole video on that called the Petabyte Pi Project, so I'm not going to get into it here, but if you look closely, you can see the fans aren't actually spinning. I'm not actually running that server yet since I'm going to revamp my local storage setup later this year, and I'll be dealing with that in a video, so make sure you're subscribed. Under that, at the bottom, is the UPS that I got for free from a local business that had closed down. I actually bought a used network card for it off eBay so I can hook it up to my network. I'm integrating it into Home Assistant and using network UPS tools to integrate it into my other server's power management. I don't have all that working quite how I like it yet, but I will soon, so if you subscribe, you'll probably hear more about that setup next year. And here in my office/studio where I'm recording, I have a second rack where I have another 10 gig switch, my main workstation, which is a rack-mounted Mac Studio, and my audio processing hardware. And just to be complete, here's the back of the main rack where I have a PDU mounted to distribute power to all my devices. And here's the back of my office rack. I'm not going to win any awards for cable management, but it's functional. So as far as a data center goes, this is nothing. But for a home lab, there's actually a decent amount of gear. And trying to manage every device by hand in my spare time would be impossible. I mean, you could just throw equipment in the rack and let it sit until it's hacked or dies, but if you want to have a secure, useful home lab, you have to do stuff. You have to configure everything. You have to have backups. You have to test the backups. You have to have a patching workflow, and you have to be able to replace and upgrade hardware. And I choose to do as much as possible with Ansible. One of the most important things, and something that you can set up in your own home lab pretty quickly, is to have some sort of maintenance and upgrade playbook. I have a Homelab project that has this Ansible inventory file. It has all the connection details for all the Linux, FreeBSD, Raspberry Pi, and IoT devices on my network. With that inventory, I can run things like this upgrade playbook to quickly upgrade and reboot all the servers for maintenance, but also if there's ever any urgent patch, like for Heartbleed. It's still a work in progress, and I'm also interested in getting my 2 Windows machines under management, but I'll be publishing all this on GitHub soon. The Homelab project also has a playbook that sets up the displays and hardware on all the Pis in my Pi rack. Since I maintain a lot of open source code for each of the main parts of my Homelab, I have individual device configurations split out into their own playbooks and GitHub repos. But if I were doing this just for myself, I would probably store all the playbooks in one repo. The first Pi, the one you see here, runs Pi-hole. Pi-hole provides local DNS and tracker blocking on my network. It also is running Prometheus and Grafana, and I use it to monitor things in my house like internet performance and some environmental sensors. All that is running in a set of Docker containers set up by Ansible. The configurations are all Ansible templates, and this makes it so I can maintain this open source Internet Pi project. And this project has hundreds of users, and it's really cool to see how other people have expanded it and monitor even more things in their home labs. And just before AnsibleFest, I added on monitoring for my actual router so I can measure performance both at the edge and inside my network. It's a little tricky with a consumer router, but I was able to get it working, and I have a blog post where I go into detail how I did it. I've been burned by a lack of visibility into my production infrastructure so many times before, and it's really helpful having this home lab environment where I can explore different tools and visualize things in different ways without risking those production systems. I mean, some people would look at that and say, you're just taking your work home with you. But, well, yeah, I guess maybe you could look at it that way, but that doesn't make it any less fun and rewarding for the people like me who love dealing with their home labs. I'm also running a few other Pis in the rack, like a Pi running my backup scripts, another one running PyVPN, and a couple more running a Drupal website and an NVR for network video recording for my security cameras. All those Pis are managed by Ansible playbooks, and I'll have the links down in the description as well. I also have a few scrappy playbooks for some of the other devices, like the Home Assistant Yellow here. There's actually a Raspberry Pi inside, but since it's managed by Home Assistant OS, I haven't found a good way to fully integrate it into my other automation, which is a little ironic because that Pi is actually controlling all my home automation. But since it's just running Linux under the hood, I'll find a way. I also have two Macs I use for my main workstations. There's this Mac Studio in my office, and also a MacBook Air I take on the road. Some people just YOLO and use Cloud Sync and Cloud Apps to make multiple computers work for them, but me? I use Ansible. So I have this playbook that I use to fully automate the configuration of both Macs, even including things like the position of all my dock items. I won't dig deep into it because I actually already did that at last year's AnsibleFest, and there's also a whole video about it linked below. But there's a lot left. You might have noticed there are a lot more devices in my two racks, especially all the network switches, the NASs, and my router. And speaking of the router, earlier I showed you this picture of my internet connection, and you're probably like, oh, Jeff has gigabit internet. Nice. Well, no, I didn't show you the rest of that graph. I mean, 40 megabytes of upload isn't nothing, but it can be painful when I'm trying to ship an offsite backup of a 200 gig video project every week. And you can also see a bunch of dips on there. One of those was when I was running a backup, but those other three are full outages. I get at least 1 or 2 outages a month, so I've been working on a new router setup with a 4G fallback. Right now, I'm waffling over whether to build it with plain Linux or use OpenWRT, we'll see. But either way, my Pi router project is also up on GitHub, and right now there isn't any automation around it, but hopefully that'll be wrapped up soon in another Ansible Homelab playbook. Unfortunately, there are some devices like my managed switches that don't have any Ansible modules, so I'm still trying to figure out how to manage them better. Right now, I have to go into the UI in my browser, and that's just not fun for someone who loves automation. There is a little support for Router OS for my main switches, but nothing at all for QNAP for my PoE switch. If you get network equipment from one of the better supported vendors, you can automate things a lot easier. But wrapping things up a bit, people who manage Homelabs do it for a lot of different reasons. But I think for most of us, whether the Homelab looks like a shrine to computing or something that would be home in a trash dump, we just love the thrill of learning. And cosplaying as a sysadmin. You get full control over an environment where mistakes can be made, and should be made, on a small scale, so you can learn better ways of dealing with them on larger scales. And just like with the hardware, the same goes for automation. In some cases, you can manage every single bit of your Homelab using Ansible automation. From your network router to IoT devices, most things have an Ansible module or collection ready to use. If you can do it on the command line, chances are you can do it with Ansible. My Homelab is growing every day, and if you want to use any of my automation in your own Homelab, check out my projects on GitHub, and there are links below. Until next time, I'm Jeff Geerling.